This is Andrea Moodie, and you're watching the TV Writer Podcast.
Hosted by Gray Jones, the TV Writer Podcast is brought to you by Script Magazine and ScriptMag.com, the leading source for script writing information in print and on the web, and by Final Draft script writing software, the entertainment industry standard for script writing worldwide. My name is Gray Jones, and I want to welcome you to the TV Writer Podcast, partner of Script Magazine, episode 22 for Monday, May 23rd, 2011. Well, today I am so excited to bring you an interview with Canadian writer Andrea Moodie, and this is actually a privilege because it's the very first time I will have interviewed somebody who I've actually worked with in a professional capacity. I've worked with Andrea on actually season 5 of Property Virgins, and Andrea is a very unique writer. She has written in features, TV dramas, documentaries, factual television, interactive, and webisodes, and she is going to talk a lot about the differences in writing for these different mediums. So it's a very, very interesting interview that I'm sure you're going to love. First, a few details. One of them is that, as I mentioned on the last podcast, the TV Writer Chat has been launched, and it was a great success and continues to be very, very exciting. Every Sunday night, right after Script Chat, at 6:30 p.m. Pacific or 9:30 p.m. Eastern, you can go on Twitter and use the TV Writer Chat hashtag and get involved in a conversation about various topics, and there's lots and lots and lots of people who participate. You can find out about the details of the various topics that are going to be covered at tvwriterchat.com, and you can find out about the easier ways that you can actually do it. There's a website that you can go to where you don't actually have to type the hashtag every time, and there's some other tips. One of the things that I like to do is I actually like to have a column in my tweet deck just for TV Writer Chat, and it shows me the tweets as they come. There's other tips like that, but I urge you to take part if you're interested in TV writing. There's going to be various guests involved, like Chad Gervich is going to be on an upcoming TV Writer Chat on June 12th, and other exciting things are going to take place. Make sure you take part. And during the week, if you want to tweet to this same group, you can use the TV Writer Chat hashtag on Twitter, and it will go out to the various other people who are following this group. And also make sure you do follow the Twitter account at TV Writer Chat to get announcements related to the TV Writer Chat. As well, there's some new homework on the table. The excellent Elephant Bucks by Sheldon Bull, and this is all about writing television sitcoms. It's a great read, very, very worthwhile advice. And I actually met Sheldon at the Toronto Screenwriting Conference recently, and he's just a great, great guy and has a lot of great lessons to share. So you can buy that book at tvwriterpodcast.com. Go to the store link, and there's a Canadian and an American version of the store. There's lots of great books there. Feel free to browse, and any book you buy through that store helps to support the podcast. But certainly Elephant Bucks is a great one to have on your shelf, and I'll be interviewing Sheldon in the month of June. So make sure to read that soon so that you can get your questions in for Sheldon Bull. As you're at tvwriterpodcast.com, make sure you check out the Twitter database, which is surpassed 700 writers and continues to climb. Make sure one of those that you can follow is me. At Gray Jones is my handle, and you can get news on upcoming interviews and get your questions answered. Make sure you do go to scriptmag.com, our partner on this podcast. They've got lots of great resources for writing, including Jean Bowerman's Balls of Steel. She always has great advice for writing not just features, but television as well. And on to Andrea Moodie. I'm going to read her bio. Andrea Moodie is a Canadian writer located in Toronto, and most writers interrupt their lives to write. Andrea interrupts her writing for life. Writing in all forms consumes her, and she's always got an idea of a new project. And more often than not, it's in a different area than she was writing before. Many of her projects in all different kinds of mediums have won awards, and this includes Geminis, Webbies, and a whole bunch of other stuff. She's written and story edited feature films, documentaries, scripted dramatic television, reality and lifestyle TV, web episodes, interactive content, and games. Some titles you might recognize: Property Virgins, Animals at Work, The List, the sci-fi drama Sci-Factor, Webisode missions for Sci-Fi's Sanctuary as well. She's a graduate of Queen's University Film Studies, the Drama Studio London, USA, and the Canadian Film Centre. Andrea is an active member of the writing community as a juror for the Dora, Gemini, and Writers Guild Top 10 Awards. You're going to love this interview. Let's roll. Enjoy. This is great, and I'm here with TV and feature writer Andrea Moodie, who's actually here with me in Toronto, not right here with me, but it's a privilege to have you with us, especially because this is the very first time I've had somebody on the podcast that I've actually worked with. How are you doing, Andrea?
I'm good. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, and it's interesting talking this way instead of face-to-face. So, of course, worked on season 5 of Property Virgins together. And work in and out of the same building sometimes. But I am so excited about having you on the podcast because I think that there is a lot that you can teach people. And not just teach, but I really think just by looking at you as a writer that we all have a lot to learn.
Like what?
Well, I said it in the introduction to the podcast, but I really feel that most of us, I think most of the people who listen to the podcast are budding writers. I think people who are actually working in the industry, maybe there are some of those who listen, but I think the vast percentage are people who are trying to break in. And most of us have careers and jobs and families and other priorities, and it can be really, really hard to squeeze writing time. And what I hear from people is, how do I get more writing time? And I feel like it gets pushed out of my day, and how do I schedule it? And so it's like we're interrupting our lives for our writing. And what I know about you from working with you is that you interrupt your writing for your life.
I should probably interrupt my writing for my life a little bit more than I do.
And I know that you shared that a lot of that came from just how you were brought up, and that you've came from a family that was readers and writers, and that was instilled in you in an early age. But why don't you tell me a little bit about that, about how you came about that attitude towards your life?
I think it started probably right from the get-go with this excitement about books and stories and reading, and then for some reason reenacting those stories when we were like tiny, reenacting like The Two Bears or Snow White and the Dwarf, because we had a limited cast, and we were like always trying to put the stories that we were reading up on their feet. I don't know why we did that. Both my parents are teachers, so that's probably part of it. And the big excitement was the trip to the library. Like, yay, we get to go to the library and get more books. So I think right from before I could even read, I was already excited about the idea of story and physicalizing that story, like making it happen.
And so I know that already as of university you were in film studies. So were you doing plays before that, or you were really focused on film, or how did that happen? It was
a real mixture. I made my first film with Darcy and Ernie. It was a Super 8 film we made in the basement. It was a horror film. And I think we must have been 15 then, so it was not a very good film, but we sure did have a good time making it. And then I did a lot of theater in high school and university, a collective play creation, playwrights workshop. So I ran a children's theater company the summer between high school and university, and we wrote all our own material. So I sort of, again, was like, taking ideas and then putting them on their feet and then honing the stories and then making them happen. I guess I always kind of had that drive to do that.
Mm-hmm. And so you did go to Queen's University.
Yeah.
And it's known more for its film studies than its film production.
Mm-hmm.
And so when you finished at Queen's, what do you feel you had to bring to the industry from that program? I personally, I don't actually know that much about that program.
I loved being at Queen's because the focus was on the theory and the technology was just starting to take off and change really rapidly.
Mm-hmm.
But the theory, like I focused on, this is going to sound like really esoteric, but it's not really, psychoanalytic film theory. And I had a feminist focus because it was the 80s. And I was like really excited about new ways of looking at the world and looking at story. So Queen's was a fabulous place for me to be, both because the theory department was great, had incredible profs, and also because I was able to do just as many courses in drama as film. So I got all this theory in the film department, and then I could put it on its feet really fast in the drama department. So I trained as an actor and a director and a playwright in the drama department. So it was a really, for me, a perfect synthesis of sort of great ideas and then also like really physical, practical ways of exploring story. So I had a fantastic time at Queen's. It was really great.
Sounds like it. And Drama Studio London, USA. What is that? I noticed that on your bio.
It doesn't. That branch doesn't exist anymore. The Drama Studio London is still in London and still going strong. It's a really popular theater school. And for a while in the 80s, they opened a branch in the States so we could get American training and British training in the same place. So I did a year of theater school there, which was great. We had an amazing group of students going through at the same time, and it was a really great stretch. We did all sort of the usual plays that you do at theater school, but we also had a lot of movement, like Feldenkrais and Alexander, Laban, dance. So we were working on a lot of different levels. So as a performer, it was a really great. Like we got all the classical Shakespeare stuff, but then we got all the kind of modern West Coast American stuff at the same time. So it was great. Yeah.
Very, very cool.
Yeah, it was great. It was a lucky experience.
And like many of the Canadian writers who have been on the podcast, you went to the Canadian Film Center as well, which to explain to the American viewers who haven't seen the other podcasts, that's kind of like a Canadian version of the American Film Institute, started by Norman Jewison. And when did you go to the Canadian Film Center?
A long, long time ago. I went to the first writers boot camp.
Wow.
So that was 13 years ago? I think so, maybe 14 years ago.
I guess that's not that long ago.
Yeah, it seems like a long time ago. Yeah, and we worked like 3 months full time. We developed feature scripts. We learned a lot about pitching. We had to pitch all the time, new projects and new ideas. And so we're developing a lot of material. And some of that stuff I'm still working on and still moving forward to try to get it made, because it was like a 3-month-long brainstorm with really great mentors. So a lot of developing our own material, and it was a really small group. So it was really hands-on, and the mentors were great. I mean, we had Joan Tewksbury came in to see us, Penn Densham came in to see us.
Oh, he's great.
Yeah, so it was really, Al McGee and Tekka Crosby were running it then, and they were amazing, incredibly supportive kind of group of people. So I had a lot of fun there. It felt too short. It was like 3 months long, and it was really intense, and then whoop, it was over.
Wow. So that was like 97, 98-ish?
Yeah, somewhere in there.
So you had already done features before that.
Yeah.
You were assistant to Barry Stevens?
Yeah.
On the Diary of a Street Kid in 94?
Yeah.
And so how did you get hooked up on that gig?
I lived with Barry.
Okay, I guess that would help.
And then he was working on the script, and I just kept doing little bits and pieces and like just giving him feedback and sort of story editing. And then when he won the Gemini, he thanked me for it.
Wow.
And that started my writing career.
Wow.
So I still leave that on the bottom of my resume, because that's really where I started, was with that mentorship and that sort of process, which was great. I learned an incredible amount doing it. It was an adaptation of Evelyn Lau's autobiography, and it was quite a long process in terms of like the number of script revisions and the number of stages that it went through. So I learned an incredible amount doing it, and then that was really what started my career as a writer.
Wow.
I hadn't up until then intended to become a writer.
Oh, really?
Yeah. I don't know what I thought I was going to do. I think I thought I was going to be a character actress when I was in my 40s. I think that's where I thought I was headed.
Really? Really?
Yeah, and then the writing really took off, and I liked it way more than acting. What I liked about acting were the playwrights workshops and improv, which is story.
Well, that is super, super interesting, and it's kind of funny because one of the things we like to do on the podcast is talk about breaking in stories, because it's something that I've learned at not only doing these but listening to other writing podcasts is that there is no one way to break into the industry.
Right.
Even though, I mean, you can read books that'll tell you these are the best things to do, and yet really every single person that I've heard has a different path, and I don't think you could necessarily write a book saying you should live with a writer.
Find the best writer you can find, move in with them, and study hard.
Yeah, but hey, it worked for you, and and so you were on the map. So you were mentioned at the Gemini Awards, and then you were writer-director of a 40-minute documentary about women living with HIV and AIDS. That was in '95, and a few other feature projects that you worked in development. And then why don't you tell me about how you got towards television? Because 99 and 2000, after the Canadian Film Centre, you were working on perhaps a more well-known show, Sci Factor, is something that you did 22 episodes of. So what led to television?
I'd done a couple of other television projects before that have been on air, and then I'd been in development a fair amount, and I was working with this amazing writer-producer, Larry Raskin, who I love working with.
Mm-hmm.
And together developed, just been finishing a show that didn't happen, and then he got offered Sci Factor, and he said, well, why don't you come along and do Sci Factor with me? Oh, okay. Like it took me a bit of an adjustment to sort of think, okay, this is a totally different show than what I thought we were working on, but we had a great time. Will Dixon and Damien Kindler were in-house at that point too, so it was a really...
Oh, cool.
Yeah, it was a really great story department.
Will Dixon and Damien Kindler?
Yeah.
Oh my goodness.
The classic Kindler and Will Dixon. Yeah, and it was really, for my first time doing an hour-long show, it was an amazing group of people to be with.
Wow. Yeah. Sorry, I mean, Damien Kindler, I know from Sanctuary, actually, he was just at the Toronto Screenwriting Conference recently. But neato.
Yeah, Damien and I had a chance to work again last summer, like a year ago in the summer, I wrote all the online stuff for Sanctuary. And so we had a chance to work together again. It was kind of like Old Home Week briefly for that. Yeah.
Very, very cool. So after working on I guess more features than TV before that, how was it to be in a room at that time? And how was the room run for that show?
It was mayhem.
Mm-hmm.
We wrote in rotation, so and we would do notes for each other.
Mm-hmm.
So it was pretty, even though I was just coming in as a new story editor, and they'd all been on the show, and they were consulting producers. Will started with the show. He was the original writer creator guy.
Mm-hmm.
Way right at the beginning. They were pretty supportive of me just sort of jumping in with both feed and writing in rotation. And then Larry Raskin and I co-wrote the last episode together. So basically we'd sort of break a story, do a beat sheet, everybody give their feedback. Both Will and Damien were really good at, I think it was Damien would say, you have to build the oogly boogly until it bursts. There were all these things to be like, what does that even mean? I was just coming off of Doc and, women dying of HIV and AIDS, and I was like, tell me again, explain this to me. And so I had really good mentorship from all three of those guys in the process of learning how to write a Sci Factor, which is a very structured show. It doesn't look like it's structured when you see it on television, but each act had its really specific things it had to accomplish. So I learned a lot about structure, which wasn't my strength coming into it. I was more sort of quirky character, and so learning structure was great.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And
so that was, for those who don't know the show, an hour-long paranormal drama, and kind of suspense-ish too, right?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Yeah, and so then after that came some more dramatic TV. Drop the Beat. Can you tell me a little bit about that?
It was about hip hop. It was for CBC, and it was set in downtown Toronto, and it was about hip hop student radio show with Back Alley Productions. Yeah, and I was just on that briefly. I can't remember which season that was. Denise Fordham was on that, and it was Adrian Mitchell's show with Janice Lemon. It was a really, again, I keep saying that, but it's true. I have had such luck in my career. It was a really great group of people, really creative, really interesting. Adrian was really committed to trying to push the edge of the envelope. And so in terms of the character, in terms of storytelling, so it was great.
Mm-hmm, very cool.
Mm-hmm.
And since then, there's in terms of your bio, there was a little bit of a gap between 2000 2001-ish, and then towards the list. What happened in between that time?
I did a lot of interactive
Mm-hmm.
and web-based stuff between television and television. There wasn't a lot of television in Toronto for a while there, and it was just as Factual was starting to take off, but it hadn't really taken off yet.
Mm-hmm.
I did a little bit of freelancing on doc stuff, and I did a lot of web-based stuff. But yeah, so I did a lot more sort of trying to find new ways of telling stories in an interactive environment.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's very interesting, because that is actually the early part of the wave for web stuff.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So tell me about because I know we're still trying to figure out the web.
Yes.
But certainly 10 years ago, it was very, very, very green. So tell me about some of the stuff that you were working on.
I started a really, really early project I worked on with Larry Raskin back when it was before Alliance became Alliance Atlantis.
Mm-hmm.
We worked at Atlantis, and he was developing a show called Attack Patrol Group, and I came in to work with him briefly. And this is like at the stage with the internet where we would talk to television executives, and they would say things like, "Oh, I don't think that internet is going to catch on." We're trying to create a crossover show that had web-based material and had a television show that were interconnected. So it's sort of, that was one of my first experiences. It didn't fly. The Americans didn't get it. It went to MIP. It didn't happen. But then because I had an IT background already, I started working a lot more with interactive storytelling on a variety of platforms. And then the crash happened. And that was sort of a shock to everyone, because the bubble kind of burst.
Mm-hmm.
But at that point, then there were starting to be other layers of projects coming along. So more recently, I did work with Xenophile, which is one of the Toronto companies that has been doing a lot of interactive, and that they're a really interesting shop.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
Very cool. And then came Factual. And I am really, really interested to hear your story about what your first experiences with Factual, and then working with it even further, because I know we interview a lot of American Hollywood-based writers on the podcast, and it seems like in Hollywood there isn't the same kind of crossover that there is in Canada. In Canada, there's a lot of crossover between television and features,
Mm-hmm.
dramatic television and factual television, and I think that factual writing, I even posted about this on one of the internet groups, and even people who worked in the industry said, "What? There's writing in Factual?"
Yeah. Well, yeah.
So tell me a little bit about. I guess, was The List the first factual based show that you worked on?
Yeah.
And so tell me about coming in. You've never worked in Factual. You're coming in. What did you think that the writing was going to be like, and what was the reality compared to that?
It actually was pretty much what I thought it was going to be like. I've been trying to get a Factual job for a while,
Mm-hmm.
and I'd done doc and I'd done drama, and I would go into a meeting, I'd say, I've done doc, I've done drama, I can do this Factual thing, I know I can. And people are like, yeah, but you don't have any experience doing a property show or a design show or a wedding show or a makeover show. And I'm like, yeah, but I'm sure I could do it. So they needed somebody really quickly on the list to come in. It was a show that had a lot of difficulty, and they were just up and running. And I went to the interview, and I kind of thought, they needed somebody for a month, and that would probably be it if I lasted that long. And they needed a body right away, and I was sitting there.
Mm-hmm.
So, and the producer on that was from England, and she was like, yeah, that makes sense. You've done drama, you've done documentary, you can probably do this. And I stayed for 2 seasons. And that gave me a real ground, because The List was a segmented show, so 5 segments per episode. So I got to cut a cooking show. I got to cut a wedding show. I got like segments, right? So by the time I'd finished The List, I'd cut with the editors pretty much every kind of segment you could imagine would be in a factual entertainment show.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a really great way to sort of cut my teeth. And it was really a lot of long hours and a pretty intense push. But we had a really amazing edit team.
Mm-hmm. Let's break this down, because to somebody who doesn't know about factual writing, the very fact that you would say that you are working with the editor would sound weird.
Yes.
You're a writer, aren't you? In the writing room, and so explain to somebody who maybe doesn't know at all about how the factual industry, writing wise, works.
Okay.
Your process for an episode. What happens when the footage is actually, even before the footage is shot?
Yeah.
What's your role before it's shot? What's your role when the footage comes back?
Okay. It varies from show to show. At its most extreme, I might start with the story with the researcher right at the beginning.
Mm-hmm.
The researcher would be setting up the participants and setting up the story ideas, and often setting up the locations that things are going to happen in. Although sometimes that's the coordinator. So, but they're the first person, first point person with the story usually is the researcher.
Mm-hmm.
So I could end up, and some shows I do, working with the researcher and the director, and then developing beat sheets, which then often go to the network for approval. So this is the story we think we're shooting.
Mm-hmm.
So
and let's maybe do some hypothetical examples. Like, say, for instance, the researcher might identify, we want to tell a story about this. Let's go find one.
Yes.
And so I don't know what's an example from one of the shows that you've done that you could sort of follow an example like that and make it practical.
Okay, practical example.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, here's a good practical example. So what would happen is they would be looking for participants, right?
Mm-hmm.
So the researcher would be looking for casting. Sometimes the casting director's involved. Sometimes it's the researchers, producers heavily involved at that stage. And then from there, once they've got participants, they've got a lot of information about them and what their story might look like, right? So like a he said, she said. So he wants downtown, big house. She wants suburbs and something ranch style or something. So you start to get a feel for the story. So then the director and the researcher, producer, sometimes the story editor is involved at that level, would put together a beat sheet. Mm-hmm. Sometimes on some shows, the story editor is not involved at that stage at all.
And so for a beat sheet, you've talked, or the researcher has talked to these people, and you get an idea of what their story is,
what it's likely to be, yeah,
what it's likely to be, and you already, even before this thing is even shot, you've already identified what you think some of the challenges are going to be and what some of the story elements are going to be. Yeah. So this beat sheet, to the uninitiated, is you're predicting the beats of the story.
Yeah, and sending it to the network for approval.
Which, I'll be honest, that is quite fascinating to somebody outside the industry. The very fact that you can actually predict and get network approval on what you think the beats of the story are going to be,
yes,
before you even shoot it.
Yes.
And this is supposed to be reality happening in front of you.
Yes. Yes. Stories are, this is the thing, the stories even in Factual are very structured, because you have to pick what you're going to shoot. Mm-hmm. So you can't just send out there's no money in Factual to send out a film crew to follow every single person around for their whole daily life until they buy a house. Mm-hmm. Right? You have to sort of pick your battles. Now, this is why you need a story editor, is because then you go and shoot it and it doesn't turn out anything like what you thought. 9 times out of 10, some of what you think is true, but the story also evolves. So once the episode is shot, and this is something that there's a lot of coordination between production and post-production either through the producer, who lets you know how things are shaking down, or sometimes directly, like the directors will phone the story editors back and forth and say, the story's changing, it's moving, it's gone in a different direction. So people are sort of keeping on top of the stories as they evolve over a period of weeks or months. Mm-hmm.
And usually, so say for instance, there might be several days of shooting, except that these days of shooting might happen 2 days this month, 2 days next month, 2 days the month after that.
Absolutely.
So you've shot your first 2 days, the footage comes back. Usually there's transcripts made.
Yep. In the case of most of the shows that I've worked on don't have transcripts.
Oh yeah, okay.
Yeah.
So the footage comes back, and unlike scripted, in scripted, all this happens after you write the script. But with Factual, you as the story editor will watch the footage.
Yeah.
and you have to try to discover what the story is from what comes in.
From what got shot.
And
Yep.
so you'll take the first couple of days of shooting, and you've got to look at that footage. You've got to evaluate, is this anything like the beats that I thought were going to be there?
Yep.
And then you may change the story at that point. And I remember those beat sheets, how every time there was more footage shot, all of a sudden the beat sheet would totally change.
Yeah.
And it's a very quickly evolving process, but but as a writer, it's very much like in scripted, how you might be in a room trying to break a story, because that'll happen in a room as you're trying to break the story. Something will go on the board, but then it doesn't work with something else. You got to wipe that off and start again. And now, correct me if I'm wrong. You tell me. As you're working with the footage coming in, do you think that this has helped your dramatic writing, being able to work with these people and quickly be quick on your feet to change these stories as they come in?
Sure. And also, I mean, one of the things that I find fascinating about working in Factual is that the characters do such unexpected things because they're real people.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's like working in documentary, except it's much more structured. So you've got that structure like you would have doing a dramatic show, but you have characters that are real human beings who do whatever occurs to them to do. So, and obviously there's things that are set up that get a certain response. Like there's always the bubble burst. They go take a look at the house that's their dream house, and they discover how much that costs.
Mm-hmm.
And then they have to have a reality check, right? So that's sort of something that's built into the show. And then you see what their response is going to be to that. And then you move from there. So some of it is sort of structured for a particular response. And then, when they go to see a house or to buy a house, whatever happens is kind of what happens. So there's a mixture.
Mm-hmm. And so whether or not you get transcripts, sometimes you do, sometimes you don't. Definitely, it's easier if you do.
Yes.
But as you look at the footage, often you'll end up making some kind of a transcript from it, or at least logging the footage and getting to know what's there.
Yeah.
And then the fascinating part about this, again with comparison to scripted, is with scripted, it's only people at the producer level that start to be able to get involved with the editor. But in Factual, the story editor works side by side with the editor. Tell me about that part of the process.
That's the most fun.
Mm-hmm.
Because they're the partners in making the story. Like working in drama, the story starts with the writers and the story team, and then it goes to production. And all sorts of things happen. Then it comes back to the editors again, and then the writers and the editors get back together again. They're the story people on either end, right? And then in between, all sorts of other things happen. So not that everybody on set isn't also interpreting the story and doing the story, but the two places where the story really gets reshaped are at the front end and the back end.
Mm-hmm.
And then it's evolving on set. It's always evolving. Like the directors talk about following the puck, right? When they're doing Factual, they're following the puck all the time. But what I love about doing Factual is that, and doc is the same for me, and a lot of interactive is like this as well. I'm right there working with editors. So I have 3 or 4 editors that I'm working with on a daily basis. And they're just the most fun people to work with because they're so sensitive to story and telling story visually. And so I'm always learning from them what they're bringing to the process. And on shows that are moving really quickly, it's actually the editor will just lay down all the material sort of in a rough assembly. So like 50 or 60 minutes for what will come down to 22 minutes.
Mm-hmm.
And then we'll look at it and we'll say, okay, where's the story here? How's this going to work? And then we start to hone the story and shape it down together. And then I'll start writing the scripted material to go with it.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a really collaborative experience, but it's not as crazy as being on set. There's just like 2 of you. So it's not loud and crazy, but it's really creative. And the editors are such a unique group of people. They self-select to sit alone in the dark all day. So it's like this amazing privilege to get to go and sit in their little dark spaces with them and look at the footage and work the story together. I mean, that's the funnest part for me.
Yeah, and there's some really, really neat stuff that happens and on a number of different levels. For one, as you do get the footage in, you can say, we're not getting enough reaction out of this person, and you can actually give direction for the next shoot to say, I want you to push these buttons.
Yeah. So we can send edit notes back, or either, and it depends on the show, either just talking to the producer will come in and we'll have a chat and we'll say, these are the things we're noticing or not noticing. And then they can push it back out to the directors. Often the directors know too. They're like, we're having a hard time with this. We might not get as much as we thought.
Mm-hmm.
Or this couple is really like, they're wild and crazy. We could even go further with it. So there's a fair amount of feedback back and forth between set and the edit suite. But because we're editing usually as they're shooting, there's a lot of feedback back from the edit suite out to the field as well. So it's a nice back and forth.
Mm-hmm. And then as the story gets honed and shortened, another one of your roles is to write voiceover, and also not just voiceover, but write dialogue for the on-screen host to say.
Yep.
And so tell me a little bit about that.
I think the thing about writing the VO is to keep linking it back to the story beats so that it's progressing the story. So instead of just saying you're looking at a 5-course dinner here, you're saying something about the character and their relationship to how they got to the point where they got the 5-course dinner, having stick-handled around problems with the turkey. Or, do you know what I mean? So that you're always trying to, so you're not just describing something, you're giving it at least 1 or 2 more layers of information than just like, so if you're describing a home that someone's going to go and buy, you don't just say, oh yeah, it's got 3 bedrooms and, a backyard. You say, it's got that extra bedroom for the baby that they're looking for, and the dog is going to love the backyard because, or maybe this will cause a fight because it's not what she wants, but he's going to love it. So you're trying to always sort of make that little tiny bit of voice that threads throughout, sort of take the viewer along through the story a little bit more directly.
Mm-hmm. Very, very cool. Yeah. Well, and so I honestly think that that factual writing is, I think it's really, really appealing for a writer, because
it's wonderful.
You are much more of a producer when you're writing. You're not called a producer, you're not credited that way, but you really do the work of a producer on the show. And partly you're partly a director, you're partly an editor. I mean, there's a lot of really, really cool stuff that you get to do that you wouldn't necessarily do on a scripted show.
It's true. I think I wouldn't go so far as to say a producer, except that all the producers that I've been working with in Factual were writers.
Mm-hmm.
So they have amazing feedback in terms of what they want to do with the writing. So it's a nice back and forth with that. You don't have the same kind of responsibility as a producer, but in terms of a back and forth, it's like in drama as well. In television, the story departments are run by writers, right? And so the creative producers are writers. So there's this sort of back and forth around story and control of story, which is different than producers in feature. Mm-hmm. Right? It's a whole different ball game. And so, yeah, all of the producers, I think pretty much that I've worked with in Factual so far have come, one of the many things they've done previously in their careers has been writing and story editing, which is great.
Mm-hmm. Very, very cool.
Yeah.
And so let's move on now and talk a little bit about interactive and web. You've done quite a bit of webisode work. You did webisodes mm-hmm. for, as you mentioned, for Sanctuary on the Sci-Fi Channel, for an alternative reality game in conjunction with the series, and also mystery drama webisodes for mm-hmm. Lika's Journey. And a lot of these are very acclaimed. Won some Webby Awards and other acclaim, recognition type stuff. So tell me about that. Tell me about, so you've done features, you've done dramatic TV, you've done Factual. How is writing webisodes different?
That's a really good question. I was really lucky when I was working at Xenophile. I was working for Ted Biggs, who's an interactive producer I really like working with. We actually went to Queens together, so we go way back. Mm-hmm. And we've written together at different stages. So the actual creative process, and also Aidan Castelli, I worked with him a lot as well. And we had this sort of really fluid creative process in terms of jamming story. So it was very much like an old school television story department, except there were, 3 or 4 of us. So, and a game designer who, Nathan Charlie, I worked with quite a bit when I was at Xenophile. Mm-hmm. Great guy. So we'd have a number of different ways of thinking all in the same room. So you're thinking technically, you've got your IT guys, you've got your game guys. So you've got like a lot of different people feeding their ideas into how to create a story, because the stories are evolving and how they can be told is really changing, and it's changing really quickly. So it's an exciting area to work in because there's so much flexibility in terms of how a story might move from platform to platform, move out into the real world. Like with Love Letters to the Future, there was a whole real world experience, including a time capsule. Stuff was projected onto walls in Copenhagen. There was all the online material. People could contribute their own information and stories and so on. So there was a lot of different layers and ways that the story worked and interacted with itself. And I think that's what's really exciting about non-linear interactive storytelling.
Well, and I think what's fascinating about it too is with features, it's a very, very long process where you don't have any connection to the viewer.
Yeah.
You write something and it might get produced 3, 5, 10 years down the line.
Literally.
And it might show in places around the world that you never get to go to. And with television, it's a little bit more immediate. Dramatic television, you write something and it might get shot in a few weeks.
Yeah.
You might even be able to go to the set. With Factual, you actually get to predict a little bit, and you get to be involved in making decisions of what's being shot. But still, you don't necessarily have that direct connection with the person who watches it. You can at least see it as it's made, and you can sit in the edit suite and see the fruits of your labor in a more immediate way. But with Webisodes, you put it online and there's comments. You interact, like you said, where you might actually have you might actually tie in with something that's actually a live event. And so tell me about that immediacy with the person who's actually viewing your content.
It's interesting. It really depends on the type of storytelling. Like we were just recently developing a couple of new projects that are just at that sort of first phase of development again. And going back to some of the older projects that some of us had worked on, and we were looking at Love Letters to the Future, and we realized that although it had been over for us for like a year and a half, people were still contributing to it. It had taken on a life of its own, and it's still happening. It's still an experience for people, and there's still regular hits and still regular contributions, and it continues without us, which is fascinating to me that something would have that life that kept going and evolving out of something that we were working on a year and a half, 2 years ago. So there's that aspect of it, which is interesting. They do take on a life of their own. There's also, I guess, some immediacy too in terms of people's responses. There's a lot more user-generated content being created. And that is increasingly part of what interactive does, is create that forum for interactivity. So that's exciting. It's not immediacy because it takes a long time to develop an interactive project because there's a long tech cycle. But once a project gets up and running, and then the content is going, then it's like there's a back and forth. It actually takes longer. The development cycles for the interactive that I've worked on are actually longer than the television cycles, but not as long and crazy as feature. Does that answer the question?
Yeah. And so once it does go live, and once you do have that feedback from the fans, maybe fans is wrong word, but viewers of the material, how fascinating is that for you as a writer to have that feedback?
It can be really surprising, and sometimes kind of out of left field. What people respond to, it's surprising.
And so, man, there's been features, dramatic TV, factual, documentary, interactive, webisodes, and the interesting thing is that you're not necessarily doing any one thing in exclusion. You're continually having a lot of projects going, and I know you're shooting this weekend, and you're always writing. Tell me a little bit about just your daily process. When you leave Brothers and go home, what are you writing? And this weekend, what are you shooting? And what are the kind of projects that you're working towards?
It's a good question. What I'm shooting this weekend, that's a good question. What I'm shooting this weekend is a labor of love, quite literally. It's called 52 Words for Love, and it's an experimental feature film that mixes documentary and drama. Been wanting to make it for about 10 years and decided let's just get started shooting. So we started shooting documentary interviews, and it's just starting to take off right now. What's interesting, and I think this is the key, I was thinking about this when you were saying, how do you break in? I don't think you break in. I think you start working where you're working, and then you find other people you like to work with, and you keep developing those relationships. And over a period of time, then you have a community of people to work with.
Mm.
So you don't have to break in. You are in because you built it.
Mm.
So the 52 Words for Love I'm working with Jim Blockland and Alan Peel. We made our first short film together an embarrassingly long period of time ago. And we've worked on all sorts of different things over the years together in different capacities. We just thought, we bought a camera and got some equipment, and we're just sort of slowly building the doc side of things for a feature about how people communicate about love.
Hmm.
And at the same time, some of the guys that I work with in interactive were really interested in doing something interactive. So we've actually have an interactive storyline that melds with the feature. So it's also called 52 Words for Love. And so we'll be launching that in the fall. So we've got it's an experiment. The whole thing is an experiment just to see how we can work with story in some different ways, exploring something that's so fundamental to people, which is, how do we communicate about love, and where is it where love defies words and expression. So that's what I'm shooting tomorrow morning.
Very, very cool.
Yeah.
And your personal process for writing, are you just always working on different kinds of projects? Are you working towards a certain few, or how do you, when you do go home and write, what are you writing?
I think there's like 3 distinct ways that I end up working on things. I think one is I go out there and I get the best possible money gig I can get. And I really like working with the same people over and over again. Once I get a process going with someone and I like working with them, I want to keep working with them. So I'll go after a job that I really want to do, like a TV gig, and say, hey, I really want to do this. Like, I really wanted to work with Crystal Leonard again. I'm like, Crystal, I want to work with you again. Right? So I pursue people that I want to work with and try to be on shows that they're doing, because I really like their process. I really like what they do. I have a couple of people that I work with a lot. And so the other way that work comes to me is they phone up and they say, I've got this weird idea of this thing I want to do a proposal on because I want to do this project. And I go, okay, cool. I'll help write the proposal. So that is another way that I end up overworking.
So like pro bono, or is it something that you get paid for?
It really depends. Some of it's pro bono for sure. And then some of it is like, we got a little development money. We need to get this next thing out for a funding application. And then, so we start developing stories that way. And then the third way is just, I'm always thinking of ideas of things that I want to write. And I have more than enough things I want to write to last me until I'm 90. So I just keep doing it. You get up in the morning, you make a cup of tea, you can sit down and get started.
Very, very cool.
Literally. Or walk to the edit suite and sit down and get started. Yeah.
Very cool.
And I think there's that sort of that feeling of, I mean, the thing is that I love doing it. It's hard and it sucks. A lot of the time when I write sucks. It sucks so bad. You would not want to read it. It sucks so bad. But that's part of my process. I write a lot. I tend to overwrite. So like if
the vomit draft.
or 5 or 6, like if I'm writing a scene, quite often I'll write 5 different scenes of the same, it's going to be the same placeholder, like in a drama piece or an interactive piece. I have a scene where 2 characters have to meet for the first time. I'll write it in the laundromat, I'll write it in the kitchen, I'll have 5 or 6 variations and I'll pick one, and I'll keep going. So I think some people write straight through, like a draft, but I kind of write a lot of scene material and then start figuring out kind of the order that it would go in, and then I go back to the outline, and so I do a lot of writing in a circle. So it takes me a long time sometimes to write something, because I write a lot of material for what I keep.
Yeah, but then it bubbles down to
Mm-hmm.
The very best.
Mm-hmm. Well, it boils down to something
hope.
I can tolerate. I think that's close to it.
Yeah.
I liken it to quilting in a way. My mother's a quilter,
Mm-hmm.
and I think there's a way of writing scene material that's sort of like making fabrics. And then you sort of cut up all the bits and pieces and sort of lay it out and look at the pattern, and then sort of cut it up some more and rearrange the pattern, and then write some more scenes. And so there's sort of a very sort of loose circular process that I get into when I'm developing new material. And some projects take a long time. Some sit in cue cards in my basket for a long period of time, and some just really are like, I just want to get them written.
Mm-hmm.
So, every project's different too.
And now you shared about some of the challenges in wanting to get work in Factual, but now after having doing a bunch of it, what kind of advice would you give to somebody who wanted to become a Factual writer?
I think there's a couple of routes into story editing and Factual.
Mm-hmm.
Some people come out of having done some documentary work. So that's one way of coming in. Some people come in through the research, through working in research.
Mm-hmm.
I've seen that happen. A couple of really talented story editors came out of directing doc and Factual, and then came to the dark side and joined the post teams. And they had a really good feel for story, and they knew what they were looking for in terms of that kind of work. So that could be a route in.
Mm-hmm. And I know one thing is initiating, especially. I mean, I've actually ended up doing story research on a number of shows that I've worked on, just because I took the initiative to do it.
Mm-hmm.
And because you're always looking for good stories in Factual, and so if you can find them yourself, then people will give you a chance to develop it. And if you're doing the research and you put the work in to say how you think the story might go, and you can prove yourself that way, I'm sure that would be a very effective way to get in.
Mm-hmm. I think for me, the way that I got pretty much all the work that I've ever gotten was through somebody that I knew, that I knew before in another capacity. Like how I got the interview at the List was one of the editors who was working at that company at the time was a friend of mine that I'd gone to university with. And so she knew I was looking for work, and she knew there was suddenly a job opening, and there I was, at least in the door to do the meeting. And I think people are willing to take a risk on somebody they've worked with before in a different capacity because they know who you are, right? Like if I've already worked with you, if I needed a story editor, I'd be willing to take the risk on that because I know you and I've seen your work as an editor, and I would think, yeah, of course he can do that job, and that would be great. And I would pick you over somebody that I'd never worked with before, right? Because I know your sensibility, I know your style. And I think that's a lot of it, is finding people that you like to work with. And then they get more work too, right? Mm-hmm. So people that I did freebie short films with 20 years ago now are like, they're executives, right? Hey, I remember you, right? Because you have history with them. So I think that's a lot of getting work isn't so much about breaking in. It's about finding the people that you want to work with who have a similar sensibility, and continuing to stay in touch and continuing to work with them as their careers evolve and your career evolves.
Mm-hmm. That's exactly what Will Smack said.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then the thing is that then it's exciting to go to work because you really like the people you work with, and you have a high level of trust and a great creativity, like a good process going. And it's just a way happier, more productive way to work.
Yeah. Well,
there's no need to suffer for your art.
Well, that is very, very wise advice, and I think that's a great place to end up.
Yay.
Well, thank you so much for taking your time. I know that one of the things about Factual is there can be long days, and I know you got to shoot this weekend, and so thank you for taking this time. I'm sure it will be of great encouragement and a lot of learning for people who maybe don't know as much about these other ways of writing.
Thanks.
Cool.
It was a pleasure.
Yeah, and so I'll see you at the office next week, I guess.
Yeah, it was very fun.
Cool. Well, thanks, Andrea.
Have a good weekend.
You too.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Take care. Bye.
Hosted by Gray Jones, the TV Writer Podcast is brought to you by Script Magazine and ScriptMag.com, the leading source for script writing information in print and on the web. And by Final Draft script writing software, the entertainment industry standard for script writing worldwide.